Even as the United States and Iran held talks in Oman on February 6th, Washington has not ruled out the possibility of using military force against Tehran. The continued deployment of significant U.S. military assets to the Persian Gulf has fueled fresh speculation that Iran could become the target of a military strike in the near future. However, an attack on Iran would not be a purely military matter. It would carry complex risks, not only for Tehran, but for the entire Middle East and the broader international security order. To fully understand these risks, it is necessary to examine the scenarios currently being considered in Washington, as well as the options Iran is now being forced to confront. The risks of U.S. military intervention. To begin with, external military intervention does not always weaken Iran. On the contrary, it could push Iranian society into a defensive posture, potentially increasing the risk of internal instability. In the event of an attack, foreign military intervention often tends to temporarily consolidate domestic support for the government in Tehran. At the same time, it provides the Iranian authorities with justification to legitimize emergency measures, expand social control, and tighten repression of political opposition under the banner of national security. The consequences would not be confined to Iran's internal dynamics. Any military escalation would also entail serious economic risks. Global energy supplies and key maritime routes in the Persian Gulf, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, would be directly threatened, with repercussions extending far beyond the Middle East. Moreover, a failed military campaign could severely damage U.S. credibility, reinforcing doubts about Washington's ability to manage large-scale strategic crises. However, if the risks of military action are too high, does the United States still have other options? Economic pressure, a familiar but ineffective strategy. Alongside the military option, another scenario that the United States is likely to continue pursuing is the intensification of comprehensive economic pressure on Iran through sanctions, blockades, and diplomatic isolation. This strategy has recently been taken a step further by Washington. On February 6th, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing an additional 25% tariff on goods from countries that continue to maintain trade relations with Iran. The move is aimed at increasing indirect economic pressure on Tehran, while forcing Iran's trading partners to consider the cost of continued cooperation. The logic behind economic pressure is not new. Prolonged economic strain is expected to generate social discontent. Accumulated discontent may translate into protests, and sustained protests can erode the government's legitimacy, ultimately weakening the political system from within. However, in practice, this strategy has rarely delivered the results Washington hopes for. Iran has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to adapt, both politically and economically, under conditions of prolonged sanctions. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear and missile development programs continue to advance, despite mounting economic pressure. And it is precisely this nuclear dimension that remains Washington's greatest concern. Iran's nuclear program and the logic of limited strikes. Although the United States and Israel possess sufficient military capabilities to deter Iran, Tehran's move closer to acquiring a nuclear weapons capability would fundamentally alter the regional strategic balance. A scenario involving severe instability or internal unrest in a nuclear-capable state would carry extremely high risks. It would raise difficult questions about weapons control, as well as the potential for conflict escalation beyond control. From Washington's perspective, the most rational approach may not be an all-out war, but rather a strategy centered on the limited use of force. A short, focused air campaign could be employed to test the resilience of Iran's political system, the response of its society, and the level of cohesion within its armed forces. If Iran were to absorb such strikes and the system remained intact, the United States could withdraw, return to sanctions, and reassess the situation. The logic behind this approach is rooted in the assessment that Iran lacks the ability to inflict decisive damage on the United States itself, while even limited strikes could still weaken Iran's military infrastructure and industrial base. However, under this scenario, Iran would not be a completely passive actor. Iran's response. Options: Facing the risk of a military strike, Iran is confronted with two primary options, both of which carry significant risks. The first option is resistance. This would involve Iran absorbing the initial strikes while carrying out calculated retaliatory measures designed to inflict sufficient cost on the United States and its allies, thereby deterring the repetition of future attacks. The chances of success under this approach are limited, but Tehran has previously demonstrated an ability to retaliate in a controlled and strategic manner. The second option is negotiation. However, this path also entails serious dangers for Tehran. Negotiations conducted under direct military pressure could involve maximal demands from Washington, not only regarding Iran's nuclear and missile programs, but also its internal political arrangements. Entering talks from such a position carries the risk of making concessions without any credible guarantee that military action would be ruled out in the future. The likelihood of the United States launching a large-scale ground invasion of Iran remains low. However, this does not mean that conflict can be avoided. Limited, strategically targeted military actions remain entirely plausible in the near future. Any such scenario would carry serious consequences, not only for Iran, but also for the Middle East and the broader international security order. In the period ahead, close attention will continue to be paid to concrete developments on the ground, the moves taken by Washington and Tehran, and the most likely scenarios should tensions continue to escalate.